I have never understood the allure of these gatherings. To most, the induction ceremonies of new species into the Galactic Assembly are moments of grandeur, of awe, of diplomatic theater. To me, they are monotonous exercises in self-congratulation. Thousands of species parade before the Council every century, and yet, without exception, the performance is identical. Timid gestures of intelligence, carefully crafted displays of culture, and the unspoken plea for recognition. I, Tark Helios, am here because my superiors insisted. A mid-ranking observer from the Ziran Command, sent to witness the presentation of a species recently discovered near the Quran fringe. My people, hardened by eons of survival in inhospitable star systems, rarely deem other civilizations worth serious scrutiny. Yet, orders are orders, and curiosity, when unavoidable, must be tolerated. The council chamber is as ostentatious as ever. A lattice of translucent platforms hovering above a swirling vortex of stellar matter, the air thick with the subtle vibrations of psychic projections translating every uttered word into a dozen languages simultaneously. Delegates drift in from all corners of the assembly, their forms and sizes as diverse as the stars themselves. I take my seat atop a platform designed for my kind, solid, angular, unyielding. A perfect metaphor for the kind of scrutiny I intend to apply today. The announcement comes as expected. A new species approaches. And as expected, every delegate shifts posture, some leaning forward, some craning necks to glimpse the novelty. I restrain a scoff. These beings have evolved for predictable environments, and predictability breeds mediocrity. I've seen it 1,000 times. A small projection shimmers into existence at the center of the chamber. The species known as the Lithari, so called by their explorers, meaning stone weavers in the assembly standard dialect, emerges. Thin, wiry, with translucent skin that catches the chamber's light like fractured crystal. They are beautiful in a fragile, almost ornamental way. Nothing about them screams power or danger. My first assessment, as always, is brutally honest, weak. And yet, there is something peculiar about the way they move. A deliberate cadence. They do not falter on the uneven surface of the projection platform. Every gesture, every shift of their limbs seems calculated, precise. Their heads swivel independently of their torsos, scanning, analyzing, not in curiosity but in assessment. Delegate Xerius, seated beside me and the representative of the Vitharii, leans close. Her voice is a low hum only audible to me through the neural resonance of our species. They are fragile, she says. They will fold under pressure. I nod, but my mind refuses to dismiss them so easily. There is a subtlety here, something beneath the surface. Fragility does not always equate to weakness. Sometimes, it is the unseen mechanisms, the hidden gears, that do the real work. The Lithari begin their presentation. Not with words but with a display of their world. A lattice of holographic constructs rises above the chamber, depicting structures that at first glance seem delicate, almost decorative. But as the simulation progresses, it becomes apparent that each construct is not mere ornamentation. It is a node in an intricate network. Entire ecosystems, engineered with precision. Water flows are redirected subtly to sustain fragile life forms. Minerals are transmuted at micro levels to optimize soil and rock composition. Their civilization does not bulldoze, it negotiates with the environment. Every building, every settlement, is a conversation with the planet itself. I lean forward, interest pricking at the edges of my cynicism. This is unlike anything I have seen in the assembly. Where most species build monuments to impress the galaxy, the Lithari have built balance, harmony, control. Delegate Xerius snorts. They are clever, she admits almost reluctantly, but they will still crumble if tested. I remain silent, studying the projection. The subtle patterns of energy distribution across the Lithari's planetary grid suggest contingency planning spanning centuries. They do not react, they anticipate. There is patience here, a terrifying patience that my own people, for all our brute adaptability, rarely cultivate. Finally, one of them steps forward, a figure of delicate grace, translucent limbs catching the chamber lights. Its voice, translated, is soft, almost melodic, but there is authority in its cadence. Delegates of the assembly, we offer our knowledge not as spectacle, but as proof that intelligence may thrive without domination, without monument, without war. We are Lithari. Our survival is our craft. Our art is our strength. A murmur ripples through the chamber. Predictably, most delegates gape at the audacity of presenting weakness as sophistication. A few like me do not react outwardly. But inwardly, a spark ignites, a dangerous curiosity. I make a mental note. These Lithari are not to be underestimated. Their calm, their patience, their subtle manipulation of the environment, all signs of a species that has survived where the strong alone might fail. The true test is not in the show of force, but in endurance, in foresight, in intelligence applied without arrogance. And as I settle into my seat, I realize, with a mixture of irritation and intrigue, that I might actually enjoy watching this play out. The Lithari may appear weak, but already they have captured my attention. The Lithari's presentation continued, and I found myself leaning closer to the projection platform, though my body told me otherwise. My species' musculature demands precision in posture, and I adjusted rigidly, as if the act of sitting improperly might betray my presence. My thoughts, however, were anything but rigid. They began to display their infrastructure not through monuments or fortresses, but through networks, endless, interconnected systems across their planet. Rivers subtly diverted, not by dams or machinery, but by vegetation engineered to nudge water along precise channels. Mineral deposits harvested and redistributed, not for wealth, but to stabilize tectonic plates. Agricultural zones positioned not for efficiency alone, but to create ecological redundancies in case of drought or disease. Every decision reflected centuries of planning, each connected to countless other decisions. A lattice of cause and effect spanning an entire world. I cannot recall a time when I have witnessed something so deceptively simple yet ruthlessly effective. My people, brutes by reputation and practice, build to survive, yes, but survival is reactive. Force solves most problems. The Lithari, by contrast, preemptively anticipate and mitigate nearly every conceivable risk. I felt a subtle tension rise in my chest. Curiosity, yes. Admiration, begrudgingly. And a creeping sense of caution. Delegate Xerius whispered again, barely audible, "Do you see it, Tark? They've avoided the obvious pitfalls. No walls, no armies, no warships. Yet they have foresight. Depth." I nodded without responding. Depth indeed. I have fought my entire life relying on reflex, strength, strategy, yes, but theirs was a strategy not of reaction but of orchestration. Each of their actions was a thread woven into a tapestry far larger than the battlefield. Their world functions like a living clockwork, and they are its invisible hands. The projection shifted to human-scale interactions. No, not humans, the Lithari themselves. I noted the fragility I had initially assumed. Thin limbs, translucent skin, eyes that seemed too large for survival in bright light. Yet I noticed something curious. They never hurried, never panicked, never overextended themselves. Each step measured, each interaction deliberate. Even the placement of their tools, their hand signals, the way they oriented their bodies toward sunlight or shadow, it all had a purpose. A fellow delegate, a bulbous, multi-limbed creature from the Krillian swarm, whispered, "They are weak, yes, but efficient. Efficient beyond reason." I ignored the comment, but inwardly I considered it. Efficiency is not merely survival, it is leverage. In my people's history, the strongest often fell to the most cunning. And cunning is precisely what the Lithari displayed. Delegate Dre, the Lithari spokesperson, stepped forward once more, their voice calm, yet resonating through the chamber with the weight of subtle authority. "We have learned to endure by understanding systems, not by dominating them. Our strength lies not in might but in foresight. We anticipate collapse and act before it can reach us. We do not conquer, we adapt." The chamber's usual murmur of polite astonishment arose. Eyes widened. A few scribes quickly jotted notes while others merely gawked. My eyes, however, were sharp. Adaptation, yes, but not blind compliance. This was active engineering of both environment and outcome. A species that bends reality to its will without the obvious violence my people rely on. I scribbled notes mentally and the pattern became clear. They thrive in obscurity. To the assembly they appeared delicate. Unarmed, unassuming, fragile. And yet their survival strategies were layered, hidden, interlocking. A failure here would be catastrophic, but they had accounted for that contingency and the next and the next. I found myself remembering my first campaigns, when the terrain itself had seemed an enemy. Mountains, deserts, freezing tundras, every landscape demanded respect. I realized that the Lithari treat the environment not as an obstacle but as a partner. My own people shape terrain with brute force, yet their power is temporary. The Lithari's is enduring. A subtle thrill ran through me, a mixture of intellectual excitement and the instinctual caution that has kept me alive through countless skirmishes. Here was a species that could survive where even we might falter. Fragility is not the same as vulnerability, and I was learning, with some unease, that my assumptions were dangerously flawed. They presented the mechanics of their societal governance next. A council of elders, yes, but not hierarchical in the way most species understood. Decisions were made through distributed analysis. Information networks spanning every settlement, every region, evaluated simultaneously. Dissenting voices were integrated into the system, not ignored. Every action had feedback loops, fail-safes, redundancies. My mind, trained to anticipate brute force challenges, could barely keep pace with their complexity. Delegate Xerius whispered again, "Do you grasp it yet? They could sit quietly for decades and outlast entire empires." I exhaled sharply, the sound lost beneath the low hum of the chamber. Outlast. Yes. This is the kind of power that cannot be measured in fleets or weapons. It is patience applied with intelligence. It is the slow crushing inevitability of someone who has accounted for every contingency while others flail. I realized then, not with pride but with an uneasy respect, that the Lithari were teaching the assembly a subtle lesson. That strength is not always visible, that the fragile may harbor a power invisible to those who measure only the obvious, that survival does not require dominance when foresight and planning can render dominance irrelevant. And as the projection ended, revealing the entirety of the Lithari's networked world, I sat back in my rigid seat. My thoughts churned, a mix of admiration, intrigue, and a prickling warning. Yes, they appeared fragile. Yes, they seemed weak. But already, I knew I would never underestimate them. I had expected the remainder of the day to be tedious. A series of polite nods, measured applause, and perfunctory questions from species who, by their own admission, had never encountered anything remotely like the Lithari. Yet, as the chamber's light dimmed and the next phase of the presentation began, I realized that this was no ordinary ceremony. The Lithari were about to test the council, and I was an unwilling witness. Delegate Dre moved again, projecting a holographic map of the frontier sector in which the Lithari had been discovered. I immediately noted the patterns, not chaotic, not random, but subtle, elegant, almost imperceptible. Their outposts, villages, and resource hubs formed geometric relationships with natural landmarks. Ridges, rivers, mineral deposits. To the untrained eye, it seemed haphazard, even naive. But I could see the underlying algorithm. Each settlement was positioned not merely for convenience, but for resilience. A flood in one region would divert naturally without destroying another settlement. Disease vectors were minimized by careful placement of living areas relative to water sources. Even predator populations were managed passively, through ecological balance rather than traps or weapons. I caught the eye of Delegate Xerius. She leaned in, whispering, "Notice the timing. Every expansion coincides with natural cycles. Harvests, migrations, weather patterns. They are never caught off guard." Indeed. I realized that the Lithari had not simply survived, they had orchestrated survival on a planetary scale. My mind, trained to calculate the brute force applications of power, struggled to process this subtlety. It was as if they had turned patience and observation into weapons far more effective than any warship or army. A murmur rippled through the chamber as other delegates noticed the patterns. I could see their confusion, the slight tightening of claws, the way the Krillian's compound eyes flickered with disbelief. One of the swarm counselors finally spoke, voice buzzing nervously, They have no fortifications. No standing army. How can they defend themselves?" Dre's projection shifted. Suddenly we were no longer looking at abstract maps, but real-time simulations of potential threats. Seismic shifts, predatory migrations, even rare but catastrophic meteor strikes. And yet, each scenario concluded with the same result: minimal disruption. Villages were rerouted, resources reallocated, populations shifted, imperceptibly. They were ready for every conceivable danger without ever deploying an army. I exhaled slowly. This was not defense. This was preemptive orchestration. I had spent decades learning to dominate through force. The Lithari dominated through structure, foresight, and subtle manipulation of their environment. Delegate Dre spoke again, voice calm, almost gentle. "We do not fight the world. We align with it. What others see as chaos, we see as patterns. We have learned to anticipate outcomes and adjust accordingly. Our strength is not measured in our ability to destroy, but in our ability to endure." I realized, with a mix of admiration and unease, that the council had underestimated them. I myself had underestimated them. And the realization settled in a quiet corner of my mind. The Lithari could survive, thrive, and outlast nearly every species in the galaxy without ever raising a weapon. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Delegates leaned forward, whispered to one another, recalculated mental models. I could see the hesitation in their postures. They had spent centuries measuring intelligence by architecture, by fleets, by displays of force. The Lithari had none of that. Yet their subtle orchestration, their quiet planning, was far more dangerous than any fleet. I caught Delegate Xirius' gaze again. Her lips curved into a rare, sly grin. "They're rewriting the rules, Tark. You feel that, don't you?" I did. A low, uneasy thrill ran through me. My species had long measured power by muscle, by endurance, by brute force, but here was a race that showed us a different scale entirely. I understood, vaguely, that this was not merely a presentation. It was a demonstration of superiority, hidden beneath the guise of fragility. The Lithari's final display was subtle. They simulated a cascade of failures. A drought, a predatory incursion, a disease outbreak, and a regional collapse of infrastructure. In every instance, their planet adjusted, redirected, and compensated. The result was almost imperceptible. Minor disruptions, minimal casualties, resources redistributed. Survival achieved without conflict. Victory without violence. I leaned back in my seat, my tail curling slightly in reflexive awe. The delegates around me were silent, shocked, trying to mask their astonishment with polite expressions. But I knew better. They were recalibrating. The galaxy's measure of strength, they realized, was about to change. Even I, a veteran of countless wars, a soldier trained to evaluate threats by their teeth and claws, felt a quiet fear. Not of conquest, but of irrelevance. If intelligence and foresight could be weaponized without weapons, what place did brute force still hold? And yet, I could not suppress a smile. I understood the thrill. Here was a species that had survived the harshest environments, outlasted their rivals, and done so through patience, cunning, and a profound understanding of systems. I wanted to learn from them. I wanted to challenge them. And I wanted, secretly, to see how far their quiet genius could go. For the first time in my career, I realized that the most dangerous species might not be the ones with the largest claws or the thickest armor. The Lithari had taught me a lesson I had not expected. Subtlety could kill where strength failed. And patience could conquer what force never could. As the chamber lights dimmed and the Lithari's presentation concluded, I remained upright in my seat. I could not look away, could not stop thinking. Every muscle in my body, every instinct honed by a lifetime of battle, screamed at me to underestimate them. But my mind, newly awakened to the quiet patterns beneath the surface, knew better. They were dangerous. They were intelligent. And I would never forget it. The council chamber emptied slowly, the chatter of delegates blending into a low hum as they retreated to side rooms and private conferences. Most were still reeling from the Lithari's display, murmuring to one another in disbelief or disbelief disguised as polite critique. I, however, had no desire to leave. I wanted to see them up close. I wanted to measure the intelligence I had just witnessed, not in projections or maps, but in the presence of the creatures themselves. Delegate Dre rose from her seat, head tilting slightly, her compound eyes narrowing with a faint, approving glint. "Tark, it seems you are intrigued." I grunted in acknowledgement. "I am," I admitted, though the sound felt rough even to my own ears. "I've seen their methods, their planning. But now I need to see how they think for themselves. How they respond when challenged or engaged directly." She studied me a moment, then nodded. "You'll find they are patient, yes, but not passive. Their intelligence is subtle, strategic, adaptive. But do not mistake their caution for weakness. Engage them incorrectly, and the consequences may not be immediate, but they will be precise. Surgical." I understood her warning, though I could not yet feel the weight of it. I followed her toward the Lithari delegation, who had withdrawn to a quiet observation chamber just off the main hall. The air grew cooler as we entered, a side effect of their environmental controls, I realized, though nothing in my long experience could prepare me for the presence of the Lithari themselves. They were smaller than I expected, slender and almost fragile in appearance, but the quiet rhythm of their movements suggested a precision honed over millennia. No hurried gestures, no wasted motion. Each movement was deliberate, purposeful. Their eyes, dark and multifaceted, seemed to scan everything simultaneously, noting patterns that would escape any ordinary observer. I stepped forward, keeping my own posture neutral. My claws flexed, my tail twitching slightly, a subtle display of readiness that I hoped read as respect rather than aggression. One of the Lithari moved forward, taller than the others by a mere fraction, but exuding a presence I could not define. Its voice, when it came, was soft but clear, carrying an undercurrent of patience that suggested millennia of observation. "Tark, we have noticed your attention. You seek understanding, yes?" I nodded slowly. "Yes. I need to see how your species thinks beyond the projections. How you solve problems, not just survive them. There was a pause, long enough for the council's remaining attendants to glance nervously at us, unsure whether intervention was required. The Lithari, however, did not move. They waited, silent, letting the pause stretch, letting me consider my own impatience. Finally, the tallest Lithari inclined its head slightly. Then we shall show you. But understand, our methods are not yours. What you consider urgent, we consider manageable. What you rush to solve, we allow to unfold. Observation is a tool more powerful than force. I felt a shiver, not from fear, but from the realization that this was true. Every battle I had fought, every conflict I had survived, had been measured in immediacy. The Lithari operated on scales of time and complexity that my species rarely considered. The demonstration began subtly. A small panel of resources, arranged like a puzzle, was placed before me. Minerals, water samples, bioengineered crops, all the tools of survival. Observe, the Lithari instructed, and then stepped back. Predict what will fail. Adapt without interfering. I crouched, inspecting the arrangement. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But patterns emerged. Minerals placed near water sources that would corrode them slowly, crops positioned in suboptimal light to encourage root growth, water redirected imperceptibly through channels barely visible to the eye. It was a test of foresight, patience, and adaptation. I reached out instinctively, almost disrupting the arrangement with a clumsy motion. The Lithari remained unmoved, silent, watching. Then a single delicate finger tapped a corner of the water channel, redirecting flow minutely, and a cascade of small corrections followed naturally. What I had thought would collapse now stabilized perfectly. I straightened, heart racing. This is intentional, I breathed. You allow failure to occur but only to correct it. It's almost surgical. The Lithari nodded. Failure teaches more than success. We do not simply survive, we anticipate, adjust, and improve. Force is unnecessary when understanding governs the system. Delegate Dre's compound eyes gleamed. Do you see now, Tark? They are architects of outcomes, not just environments. They do not wage war, they design it away. They do not need fleets, they have foresight. I swallowed, realizing that my own reliance on power, on immediacy, on brute strength, was suddenly antiquated. I had trained for decades to measure threats by muscle, by armor, by teeth and claws. But here was a species that would never need any of those. They had won before the first blow was ever struck. For the first time in my career, I felt that familiar spark of professional thrill, the recognition of genius, the quiet excitement of facing an intelligence unlike any I had known. And I also felt, deep in my core, a creeping humility. To underestimate them even slightly would be catastrophic. The Lithari's eyes met mine, and in that instant I understood. This was no mere diplomatic encounter. This was a lesson. Subtlety could be as lethal as violence. Patience could outmaneuver brute force. And understanding could secure survival where strength alone would fail. I bowed slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement more profound than words. The Lithari inclined its head in response. We were no longer just observer and subject. We were participants in a silent, intricate game of intelligence. And I knew, quietly, that the council had no idea how dangerous these creatures truly were. The council chamber had thinned, the delegates retreating to lounges, holocoms, or private discussions. I remained behind, sitting at the edge of the observation platform, watching the Lithari quietly tending to their instruments. It was not idle activity, nothing about them ever was, but to the casual eye it might appear so. There were no grandiose displays of power, no dramatic gestures of control over machines or matter. Just small, careful motions, a finger brushing a sensor here, a tilt of a lens there, adjustments so minute that only someone paying close attention could perceive them. I felt my patience tested. I had trained to read battlefield tactics in a heartbeat, movement, posture, the rhythm of aggression, but this was different. I had no frame of reference. My claws twitched, almost involuntarily as I leaned closer, and yet I could not look away. There was an elegance in their precision, a quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. One of the younger Lithari approached a small table of resources, a collection of minerals, water reservoirs, and biome samples. I had seen the projection in the council presentation, but this was tangible. I could hear the faint hum of the nutrient regulators, the subtle drip of water through channels I would never have noticed if I weren't looking for it. The Lithari tapped one of the mineral containers lightly. It wasn't forceful, just a touch, and immediately, a slow cascade of corrections began. Water levels adjusted, mineral concentrations shifted, nutrient flows balanced themselves across the samples. I blinked. I had expected mechanical adjustments, hidden programming, but there was nothing visible. Somehow, simply observing, touching, and applying the barest suggestion of energy caused the system to stabilize itself. I whispered under my breath, almost to myself, how is this possible? Delegate Dre, seated silently beside me, gave a low chuckle. This is the art of the Lithari. Subtlety is their strength. They never overwhelm, they guide. You've trained to respond to force. They train to anticipate it, or more accurately to render it irrelevant. I shifted in my seat, watching a young Lithari crouch beside a container of rapidly evaporating water. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. They simply reoriented the channel slightly, redirected a minute stream of condensation, and the evaporation slowed, the balance restored. To anyone else, it might have seemed as if the environment itself had decided to comply. I realized I was holding my breath. This is patience, I said quietly. Discipline without display. Strategy without confrontation. It's surgical. Dre's multifaceted eyes narrowed with interest. Surgical and invisible. That is why they survive where others fail. The galaxy teaches most species that strength equals dominance. The Lithari learned that survival does not require dominance, only understanding. Anticipate the challenge, adjust the environment, and victory is inevitable before the first blow is ever struck. I exhaled slowly, trying to process the implications. It was one thing to see intelligence in action during a battle simulation, when every variable was controlled. It was quite another to witness it manipulating reality itself with such imperceptible precision. They were architects of outcomes, not just their environment. A sudden vibration caught my attention. One of the Lithari lifted a small sensor, observing the rhythm of mineral dispersal across the table. I expected a readout or a warning signal, but no. Instead, the Lithari closed its eyes briefly, tilted its head, and extended a single delicate finger toward a droplet of water that had not yet reached equilibrium. The droplet shifted imperceptibly, and in moments the system corrected itself entirely. I felt a thrill of recognition, and something else, a quiet unease. My species had always relied on force, on immediate action. Yet here was a species that would never need force because force would never catch them by surprise. They were untouchable in ways that my battle-hardened mind could barely comprehend. Do you understand now? Dre's voice was soft but edged with excitement. You do not need to fight them to lose. You need only fail to anticipate them. I swallowed hard. My mind, trained for decades to calculate outcomes of war, to read the smallest gestures of aggression, struggled to find a strategy here. This was intelligence operating on a level I had never encountered. No muscle, no weapon, no armor could challenge them. Only understanding, and even that required patience and attention. The Lithari stepped back, its dark, multifaceted eyes glimmering faintly in the soft light. It inclined its head, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging my attention. I bowed slightly in response, a gesture not required but instinctive. There was a communication here, a shared recognition of mutual understanding. I realized then that the Council had not yet grasped the full scale of this revelation. Many would continue to see the Lithari as weak, fragile, unworthy of respect. I understood now that such perceptions were not only wrong, they were dangerous. Underestimating them was the surest way to lose. As I turned away, stepping back into the larger chamber, I felt a strange exhilaration. The Lithari had revealed only a fraction of their true capabilities, yet even that fraction had shifted something deep inside me. My own strategies, my assumptions, my reliance on brute strength, all seemed suddenly archaic. The Council might not yet understand what they were witnessing, but I did. And I would make sure that understanding, and caution, spread. The Lithari were not just another species. They were a force the galaxy could not afford to misjudge. And for the first time in years, I felt the thrill of facing a challenge that could not be met with muscle, claw, or teeth. The Council chamber had shifted. I could feel it before I even registered it consciously. The air was warmer, heavier, not from temperature but from expectation. Delegates murmured in low tones, exchanging glances that betrayed curiosity, and something else. Unease. I had watched the Lithari work in private, unseen, and now the ripple of their quiet competence had begun to reach the Council. I could sense it in the subtle way the Zyrene delegate adjusted posture, in the way the Polari leaned forward despite protocol forbidding casual engagement. I adjusted my seat, straightening my spine, and allowed my gaze to roam the room. The Lithari were stationed near the center, still calm, their motions deliberate and unhurried. No one would call this spectacle impressive. There were no roaring displays of power, no titanic machines flexing their might. Yet every eye that dared to watch closely caught the almost imperceptible efficiency radiating from them. Even from a distance, it was undeniable. This species was aware of far more than any of the others expected. I rose, deliberately letting my weight shift in a way I knew drew attention. In my culture, and particularly among the Tark clans, posture was a statement. Standing like this, I commanded notice, and all but the most arrogant delegates could not help but register it. Dre's voice whispered from beside me, calm, measured, "They've been underestimated for far too long. This is your moment, Tark." I allowed a small smirk, though internally I wrestled with the implications. The Lithari's strength was subtle, almost invisible, and the Council's traditional measures, muscle, fleet size, economic leverage, could not account for it. If I allowed the discussion to remain on the usual terms, they would continue to be dismissed. I needed to shift perception without revealing everything, to signal potential without frightening the Council into dismissal. Clearing my throat, I began, "Delegates, I would like to draw attention to the methods employed by the newest members of our Council, the Lithari." I let the words linger, as if giving the chamber time to realize that my attention was deliberate, that this was a deviation from the usual ceremonial acknowledgments. Heads turned. Murmurs rose and fell. I pressed on, steady, deliberate. "They are not what we have been led to expect from newly discovered species. They do not build monuments. They do not display aggressive dominance. They survive, thrive, and influence their environment in ways that surpass even our own predictions of intelligence." A soft murmur of disbelief swept through the delegates. The Zyrene, whose species prided itself on technological demonstrations, tilted its head in skepticism. The Polari fingers tapped a rhythm against the armrest, an unconscious sign of agitation. I smiled faintly, reading the signs as easily as I had once read battlefield formations. "They are subtle," I continued, voice rising slightly to fill the chamber without shouting. "They employ strategies that are invisible until observed closely. Resource allocation, environmental manipulation, risk mitigation. These are not executed through brute force, but through foresight and patience. Every element under their control is measured, balanced, and optimized, often before the threat exists. This is not mere survival. This is intelligence in its purest form." I paused, letting my words sink in. I could see some delegates' eyes narrow in interest, while others leaned back, skeptical but undeniably affected. I allowed myself a small internal smile. This was the first step, planting the seed of understanding without revealing the full scope of the Lithari's abilities. A voice from the Council, hesitant but curious, spoke, "And these methods, how do we verify them? Are we to take your observation as proof?" I leaned slightly forward, claws brushing lightly against the podium, a calculated gesture of authority. Observation is often the most reliable proof. They operate not with spectacle but with results. The systems they maintain, the environment they stabilize, the patterns they predict, these are all tangible, measurable outcomes. It is easy to dismiss their lack of grandiose displays. It is far more dangerous to do so. I saw the shift then, subtle but undeniable. Delegates who had previously treated the Lithari as insignificant now regarded them with cautious interest. The whispers grew softer but more frequent, speculation threading through the ranks. I noted a glimmer of doubt in the Aven delegate's eyes, always the most dismissive of non-aggressive species, and felt a quiet satisfaction. Even the most confident assumptions could be challenged when results spoke louder than appearances. "Mark my words," I said softly but firmly, "this species will not be controlled, underestimated, or ignored without consequence. Their power lies not in spectacle but in precision, patience, and foresight. We ignore them at our peril." A hush settled over the chamber, punctuated only by the faint hum of environmental regulators and the subtle clink of Lithari instruments. I allowed my gaze to linger on them, standing calm, steady, unassuming, yet entirely unflinching. Their eyes met mine briefly, dark, thoughtful, and filled with an awareness that surpassed the shallow metrics of the Council. I nodded imperceptibly. They understood. I understood. And now, the rest of the Council had been forced to start questioning what they had assumed to be true. When I finally returned to my seat, I allowed myself a slow exhale. The Lithari were patient, yes, but so was I. Every demonstration, every subtle hint, every carefully worded statement had shifted perception, just enough to ensure that no one would dismiss them outright. That, in itself, was victory. And yet, I felt a stirring of unease, not fear exactly but a recognition of the power I had glimpsed. The Lithari had barely begun to show their capabilities. Their patience, subtlety, and foresight were only the surface. The depth of their intelligence was as vast as the currents of the oceans they had quietly tamed. I would need to remain vigilant, as would the Council, if we hoped to understand them at all. And even then, I doubted anyone would ever truly grasp the full scope of what the Lithari could accomplish. The chamber had grown still. Too still. The murmurs that had once coursed like faint currents through the council hall had vanished entirely. Every delegate, from the massive VAR to the lithe Avon, sat frozen, eyes wide, attention riveted on the Lithari. And I, Tark, stood slightly apart, heart thrumming with anticipation, knowing full well that the moment of revelation had arrived. It began subtly. The Lithari did not announce it with blaring lights, booming voices, or any sort of spectacle designed to awe the council. They never would. Instead, it was in the data flowing across the holographic projections, the same innocuous devices they had been allowed to use for standard presentations. Energy grids, supply networks, environmental monitors, all of it shifted imperceptibly under their touch, guided by algorithms so sophisticated that no other species had the foresight to notice the underlying pattern until the results were undeniable. I leaned forward, claws pressing into the polished surface of the railing, eyes narrowing. My instincts screamed approval even before my analytical mind caught up. The Lithari were rebalancing entire planetary systems, redistributing resources, stabilizing populations, all while maintaining absolute discretion. Ships in orbit reported anomalies in trade patterns, weather simulations corrected themselves automatically, and regional conflicts that had been predicted as inevitable simply didn't happen. "By the stars," muttered a Polari delegate, tone both reverent and horrified. Their voice barely carried, but the tremor was unmistakable. They're not just intelligent, they anticipate, they optimize every variable. I could only nod. It was far more than intelligence. It was strategy so complete it bordered on prescience. And the council had finally been forced to notice. The VAR delegation stirred, unaccustomed to witnessing a species wield influence without brute force. Even Axion, ever the skeptic of subtlety, tilted his head, a rare moment of genuine curiosity breaking through his stoic exterior. "Interesting," he rumbled, tone low enough that only I could hear. "Far more controlled than even we expected." I allowed myself a slow smile. Yes, this was it. This was what I had been waiting for, the proof, undeniable and unassailable, that the Lithari were not merely clever, not merely patient, they were masters of the unseen game. The Lithari delegate, serene as ever, finally spoke. "Delegates of the Republic Council," it said, its voice calm, modulated, carrying no threat but every ounce of confidence. "We have observed your predictions, your calculations of likely outcomes for this sector. We have measured the flow of energy, resources, and potential conflict. Where others anticipate chaos, we see balance. Where others forecast failure, we prepare solutions. We act not to dominate but to ensure survival, for our species and for those who share this galaxy." Silence followed. I could feel it pressing in, as if the chamber itself had drawn a collective breath. The words were simple, almost modest in tone, yet the implications were staggering. They were not claiming power, they were demonstrating it. Every subtle adjustment, every quiet correction in the data streams had already done the work. Wars that were predicted to erupt were avoided. Economic collapses that had been statistically inevitable were mitigated. Systems teetering on the brink of ecological failure began to stabilize without outside intervention. I felt a hand on my shoulder, Dre's voice low and pleased. "Well done, Tark. You've given them the stage they deserve." I allowed myself a nod, but my gaze remained fixed on the Lithari. They had earned far more than recognition. They had earned awe, respect, and a grudging fear. I had spent my life studying species that relied on raw strength, on numbers, on brute force. And now I understood something essential. Power could wear no armor, wield no claws, yet still command the galaxy. A murmur of incredulity rose from the council floor. The Avon delegate whispered urgently to their neighbor. The Zyrene's eyes darted back and forth across their data pads as if trying to reconcile what they had just seen with centuries of assumptions, and the VAR, ever the warriors, sat back, claws lightly tapping the floor in thought. Even Axion, for all his stoic composure, allowed a flicker of admiration in his eyes. I stepped forward, deliberate, projecting just enough of my presence to anchor the room's attention without overshadowing the Lithari themselves. "Delegates," I said, voice firm, measured. "You have witnessed what we might have dismissed as insignificant. You have seen how subtlety, patience, and foresight, qualities long undervalued, can achieve outcomes that brute strength alone could never accomplish. These are not mere survivors. They are architects of stability, masters of the unseen currents that govern life across worlds. Heads turned toward me, some with skepticism, others with dawning understanding. I let the pause stretch, allowing my words to resonate. Underestimating them would be folly. Ignoring their insights would be catastrophic. They do not act for glory nor for dominance. They act for continuity, for balance. And in a galaxy where we measure success in fleets, battles, and monuments, they have quietly rewritten the rules without anyone noticing, until now. A ripple of acknowledgement ran through the chamber. Delegates shifted in their seats, some leaning forward in newfound respect, others exhaling as if a heavy burden of ignorance had been lifted. I allowed a small smile. It was a rare moment when my people's instincts aligned with diplomacy, when the force of recognition could wield as much influence as any warship. The Lithari remained still, serene, their expressions unreadable. Yet I could feel their awareness, calm, confident, and absolute. They did not need the council to understand their worth. They had already demonstrated it in the only way that truly mattered, through action, subtlety, and undeniable effect. And as I watched, a quiet sense of pride settled over me. I had seen the underestimated rise, not through fire and fury, but through patience and intellect. I had been their voice when others dismissed them. And now, finally, the galaxy was beginning to see the truth. The Council would never forget the Lithari. And neither would I. If you enjoyed this galactic journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate your hyperdrive for more sci-fi stories.